everybody, how are y'all doing today? I hope that you guys are doing absolutely amazing. My name is Nicole Andrusko and I welcome you here to my YouTube channel. Now today is very exciting for me because this is the first true crime case that I am covering ever on my YouTube channel. And if you guys caught my introduction video, I actually talked about how I first became fascinated with true crime when I was a teenager. But there was one specific case that really made me fascinated and made me want to delve and dive deeper into the world of true crime. And that case is the Lizzie Borden case. Now, in case some of you may not know who Lizzie Borden is, perhaps you may have heard of the little jump rope song and child's rhyme that was based on her case. And it goes like this. Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she'd seen what she had done, she gave her father 41. Now, the facts in that little song are a little inaccurate when it comes to the number of whacks, but nevertheless, it's based on a very true story, which is that there was a young woman named Lizzie Borden who was accused of brutally and savagely slaughtering and murdering her mother and father. And this was actually known to be the crime of the century. That's how big it was. This was during the Victorian era. So not a whole lot of crazy stuff happened back then. So this was a really big deal. So if this is something you guys are interested in learning more about, please keep on watching. So Lizzie Borden was born on July 19th, 1860 to her parents Sarah Anthony and Andrew Jackson Borden. And she also had an older sister named Emma. And the four of them lived together in a town called Fall River in Massachusetts. Now, just to give a little bit of background information about the history of Fall River, it was actually known to be a mill town or factory town, which, as you guessed it, is a town that consists of a lot of different factories, such as textile factories and perhaps even cotton mills. Now, this town consisted of primarily more blue-collar working-class neighborhoods, but it also had a very notably affluent neighborhood called the Hill, which was where a lot of upper-class members of the community lived, including some of Lizzie's extended family, such as her aunts, uncles, and cousins. Now, unfortunately, when Lizzie was only about 2 years old, her mother Sarah ended up passing away due to urinary congestion, which left Lizzie's older sister Emma to be pretty much the primary caretaker of Lizzie. It's even said that as Sarah was nearing her deathbed, she made Emma promise to her that she would watch over and take care of little Lizzie. And this was a promise that Emma took very seriously, and she followed through on her word. Now, it's actually alleged that around the time of Sarah's death, or a little bit afterwards, Andrew wasn't necessarily the most attentive or present father. He actually had a lot of different business ventures that he was involved in, and he was very understandably still dealing with the loss of the love of his life. So there were actually different women in the community, including Andrew's own sister, who offered to step in and help take care of the girls since they were going through a very tough time. The girls had just lost their mother and he had just lost his wife, but he actually ended up refusing them all and telling them that he needed to deal with his family matters in private. So as you can imagine, poor Emma had to really fill some big shoes. She kind of had to step into what her mother's role once was and had to take care of Lizzie, as well as probably having to be in charge of some of the household chores. And I feel that that's a pretty unfair expectation to place such a large responsibility and burden on a 12-year-old's plate, because that's how old Emma was. She was only about 12 or 13 years old when her mother passed. So I can only imagine just how stressful and difficult this must have been for her. But things didn't stay this way for too long, because about 3 years after Sarah had passed, Andrew Borden ended up getting remarried to a woman named Abby Gray. Now, from the get-go, neither Lizzie or Emma really cared for Abby. In fact, there came to be a point in time when Lizzie didn't even call Abby mother. She called her Mrs. Borden instead. Now, it is depicted in several different shows and articles and movies that Abby was kind of like this evil stepmother stereotype, but in actuality, the evidence seems to suggest the contrary, that she was most likely probably a very good woman and even a great stepmother, and wanted nothing more than to be able to connect and build a relationship with her husband's daughters. But unfortunately, neither Lizzie or Emma were able to reciprocate that same kind of excitement. However, Abby was not the only person in the family that Lizzie and Emma grew to strongly dislike. For as they got older, they also started to have a growing resentment towards their father, Andrew Borden. And the main reason being is because Andrew was actually known to be a very successful, prominent, and wealthy businessman in the area, an entrepreneur of sorts. He became the president of a bank. He was also into finance. He had a lot of real estate property. He was a landlord, and he also dabbled a bit in textiles. And because of this, he was known to be worth about $500,000 back then, which was a lot of money. And honestly, that's a lot of money this day. Boy, I wish I could have that kind of money. But it's actually worth about $10 to $15 million today. So that goes to show that he was doing very well for himself. However, while Lizzie and Emma's cousins got to live these very lavish, extravagant lifestyles in these big, beautiful mansions on the hill and going to these fancy balls and drinking all this champagne, the girls were instead living in a very modest, average-sized, basic house on 2nd Street in the downtown area of Fall River with their father and their stepmother, Abby Borden. And this house was known to really not have some of the basic amenities that a lot of people in the area that had the same kind of wealth as Andrew Jackson had, such as indoor plumbing or running water. Now, eventually, Andrew did cave in and allowed running water to be in his house, which I'm very glad he saw that as being a priority. But nevertheless, the girls hated this because they felt like their father was a cheapo. He was known to be a very frugal man to the extreme that people called him a penny pincher. And the girls were not having this. They felt like they were entitled to a better life, that their father could have very easily been able to provide for them. And they wanted to live like their cousins on the hill. So that's the main reason why they started to dislike their father. Another reason was because apparently he had started giving away different real estate properties to various family members, including Abby's sister. And this made the girls furious because they thought he was showing favoritism towards their stepmother. And they thought, well, if he's going to go ahead and give land and a house to their stepmother, why can't he give them a house and property? Which I believe he eventually did give property to them, and they ended up selling it back to his father after they rented it out for a while. But still, this really upset the girls. Also, apparently, Andrew didn't have a will at the time, which would mean a lot of his wealth and his assets would go to Abby when he died. And then when Abby died, a lot of that wealth may have gone to her sister. And the girls were obviously very upset about this because they felt their futures were at stake and that their father really wasn't taking their lives and their well-being into consideration in the case that he passed away. Now get this, something that actually really fascinates me is by the time the Bordens were murdered, Lizzie was already 32 years old and Emma was 41. Meaning back then in those days, they were considered to be old spinsters, which basically what that means is if you were in your 30s or 40s like Lizzie and Emma were, and you didn't have a husband or children of your own, you were looked down upon by the rest of society because back then, women didn't really have careers. women didn't even get that much of an education compared to their male counterparts. So their whole sense of identity, their self-worth, and their value was solely based on their abilities to be a good wife and a good mother. And if you didn't have either of those by the time you reached a certain age, you were pretty much done for. And so I'm thinking that probably sparked even more of a resentment towards their father, because while they could have been living on the hill, being introduced to these upper class decent men who could take care of them one day, their father was just instead very controlling, very domineering, very autocratic, and as a result, the girls didn't really get to have a life of their own. They just stayed in their little house on 2nd Street in Fall River with their father and their stepmother. Now, let's go ahead and describe Lizzie. So, Lizzie in school was described to be a very average student. She wasn't exceptionally bright, but she also still managed to get away with getting pretty decent grades. She wasn't very disruptive or defiant. She kind of just was more reserved and kept to herself for the most part. However, a lot of people didn't want to approach her because Lizzie was known to have kind of a sarcastic tone, and she also wasn't afraid to speak her mind, especially when it came to her stepmother, Abby Borden. She was not afraid to run around and tell everyone in the community, spreading gossip about how much she absolutely hated her stepmother. Now, what was very interesting to me was that Lizzie was actually a very devout Christian woman. She actually ended up going to church all the time, and she became a Sunday school teacher. On top of that, she was also very involved in different Christian organizations and charities. However, she did have a little something that she was doing that she wasn't supposed to. Actually said that Lizzie was a klepto. She stole and shoplifted all the time. It even got so bad to the point where she had such a big reputation for this that her father just told all the shop owners and shopkeepers around the area that if they saw Lizzie stealing anything from their store, that they just need to write it down and put it on his tab, and he would eventually pay for it. Which I think is pretty ironic considering she was a Sunday school teacher and she shoplifted. I mean, aren't one of the basic 10 commandments that thou shalt not steal? I don't know. It's just kind of a little interesting to me. Hey, we're all complex creatures. Some of us are a little bit more contradictory and hypocritical than others. And this is not something you should judge her on yet, because, oh man, we're going to get into the juicy details in just a little bit with this case. Now, what was also interesting was that even though I mentioned earlier that Lizzie and Emma started to grow major resentment and anger towards her father, it's actually said that when Lizzie was younger, her and her father had a pretty close relationship. In fact, she even gifted her father a golden ring that kind of symbolized their close bond. And he wore this golden ring every single day leading up to the day he died. But unfortunately, as Lizzie got older, the anger and hatred that she had for her father grew more and more. There was even one specific instance where Lizzie was taking care of some pigeons that were hanging out in the family barn in their yard. And Lizzie was known to be the kind of person who loved animals. She absolutely adored them. She loved taking care of them. And she even loved animals a lot more than she liked people, which honestly is kind of relatable. My husband and I just got a kitten, and half the time much rather stay at home with my kitten cuddling up on the couch than have to go out in the real world and interact with other humans. But that's besides the point. Anyway, Lizzie really loved taking care of these pigeons. She would go out to the barn every single day and feed them. But unfortunately, these pigeons were attracting some neighborhood boys that would try to throw rocks at the windows of the barn to scare the pigeons. And in fact, one rock one night ended up being thrown and broke one of the barn windows. So Andrew Borden was clearly very upset about this, because he decided one day to walk out to the barn and kill all the pigeons. But not just kill, he took an axe and cut off all their heads, and then took those dead pigeons into the kitchen and asked the family maid if she could turn them into stew. So, of course, Lizzie was very disturbed and angry and upset that her father did this because she loved animals and she loved those pigeons. And of course, this just added more fuel to the fire. And as the days went on, especially in the last few months leading up to Abby and Andrew's deaths, Lizzie started to withdraw herself more and more from the family and would stop even eating dinners with them, which was a big no-no back then because that was a major common family tradition that you would all sit down together at the table and have a meal together. And Lizzie just wasn't feeling it, wasn't doing it, did not want to be associated with her family, and just kind of kept to herself. So that brings us to the morning of August 4th, 1892. So all the people that were in the home this morning were Andrew and Abby Borden, Lizzie Borden, Jonathan Morse, who was Lizzie's uncle that was visiting at the time, and the family maid, who was named Bridget Sullivan. Now apparently the girls referred to her as Maggie, and I think this is because their old maid was named Maggie and they couldn't even be bothered to learning the name of the new peasant maid. So that just goes to show you how entitled and bratty they were as grown women. Kind of shocking. But anywho, it said that early that morning, Andrew and Abby Borden, as well as Jonathan Morse, sat down together at the kitchen table and had breakfast. Then around 8:45 a.m., Jonathan Morse was the first one to leave the Borden home. Now, some accounts say that he went to go buy a pair of oxen. Other accounts say that he went to go visit some other relatives. But nevertheless, he had a pretty clear alibi and wasn't seen anywhere near the Borden home at the time of the murders. Now, shortly after he left, Andrew actually decided to leave because he had a daily morning stroll he would always go on where he would check in on some of the businesses he was a part of in the area. So around the time he left, the maid, Bridget, actually was outside cleaning the house windows, and eventually later on she wasn't feeling well that day, so she went ahead and rested on her bed in the family loft. Now, shortly after Andrew left, Abby Borden actually went upstairs to the guest room where Jonathan Morse was staying and started cleaning up the room. And that is unfortunately where she met a horrific fate. In this guest bedroom is where Abby Borden was whacked 18 times by either an axe or a hatchet to the back of her head. Obviously, she did not survive this, and she ended up dying in pools of her own blood on the guest bedroom floor around 9:30 a.m. So pretty shortly after Andrew Borden had left the house. Now, Andrew Borden ended up coming home from his morning stroll around 10:45 in the morning, and he actually really struggled with getting the front door open. And that's because unusually the front door was double locked. It had a lot of latches and a lot of locks, and it kind of seemed almost as though someone did this on purpose to keep somebody out and to keep someone from coming in the home. And what's actually really interesting about this is there was a reported break-in a few weeks before this happened, and that's when Andrew decided to make sure that all the doors had multiple locks, just in case. But it was actually widely believed that Lizzie was to blame because she was a klepto, and there were some things stolen from Andrew and Abby Borden's room, such as some money and even, I believe, a gold watch and other things that belonged to Abby that she cherished and valued a lot. However, there was really no sign of forced entry, so they believe that Lizzie was to blame. But anyway, moving on with the story. So Bridget actually heard Andrew struggling to get the door open, and so she started struggling trying to get the locks undone to let him in. And she could have sworn that as she was trying to let Andrew Borden in, she heard a faint giggle from Lizzie at the top of the stairs. Which you think would be weird, because why wouldn't Lizzie have unlocked the door if she heard that her father was struggling outside? And at that time, Abby Borden was already dead, lying on the floor. So if she was upstairs and wasn't letting her father in, does that mean she was at the murder scene? Did she know that Abby was already dead? Something to think about. So Andrew eventually came inside the house, and he actually saw Lizzie near the parlor, and he asked her where her stepmother was. Lizzie responded saying that her stepmother received a message to go help a friend. It is then that Andrew Borden lied down on the sofa in their parlor room and went and took a nap. Unfortunately, at around 11 o'clock a.m., he too left the same horrible fate that his wife had met. And he was bludgeoned 11 times in the face. At around 11:15 a.m., Lizzie came across the body of her dead father and called upstairs to her maid, Bridget. And Bridget wasn't actually sleeping. She was just resting on the bed in the loft upstairs, as I had mentioned earlier. And she called up to Bridget, yelling, "Please, come quick. Father's dead. Someone has killed him. We need a doctor." Now, a doctor came and ended up examining both bodies of Abby Borden and Andrew Borden, and obviously the police came soon after to what I expect was a very gruesome, violent scene, and probably one of the worst things they'd ever seen, because back then in those days, not a lot happened. So I'm sure this is not something the police were entirely prepared for, and their police work just wasn't the greatest. Now, something that the police noted that was pretty odd right off the bat was that there seemed to be no sign whatsoever of forced entry. I mean, like I mentioned previously, the doors already had multiple locks on them. And there was a policy that whenever anyone would leave the house, Andrew had whoever was in the house lock the doors promptly after they left. So this family was very, very cautious, very careful with keeping people on the outside and not letting anyone in that they didn't know. So the fact that there was no sign of forced entry made the police a little bit suspicious and made them think that perhaps this was an inside job, meaning that somebody who was already inside the home committed these brutal murders. Another interesting thing they noticed that seemed to back up this idea that this was an inside job was that they found out that Andrew's blood was still warm and wet to the touch, and it was actually dripping, which means that had been a very recent murder. However, when they examined Abby Borden's body upstairs, her blood was more cold and dry, which meant that there had to have been at least an hour and a half between the time that Abby Borden was killed and the time that Andrew Borden was killed, which made police scratch their heads because they figured, well, if this was a random intruder, why would he kill one person and then wait 90 minutes and then kill the other? You'd think that this intruder would wait until both the victims were home at the same time so he could go bam, bam, kill one, kill the other, and get the heck out of there, right? It was just so odd. Who would wait 90 minutes? And think about it this way. This was a small house. These were narrow hallways, and there weren't a lot of places to hide, unless you wanted to get caught, I suppose. But still, it was very suspicious and seemed to again back up the idea that this was an inside job, that perhaps these murders were committed by someone who was living in the home, who was supposed to be in the home. Someone where if somebody else in the home came across them, it wouldn't be suspicious that they were there. Now, obviously, the police questioned Lizzie about her whereabouts during this time, because I'm sure you guys are all dying to know, where was Lizzie? And they actually put Lizzie through an inquest testimony that happened over the next several days after the murders were discovered. And right off the bat, the police were not feeling it with Lizzie. She just seemed to have a very cold, emotionless tone about the whole thing, almost like she wanted to be detached from it, and she really didn't want anything to do with it. And what was also very interesting was the fact that when they referred to Lizzie's stepmother, Abby, as being her mother, Lizzie snapped and she got sharp with them and said, "No, do not call her my mother. My real mother is dead," which police thought was really odd because this was such a tragic incident and her stepmother had just been brutally killed. Why did she feel it in her to just strongly correct the police officers and show this kind of discontentment and resentment towards her stepmother? So obviously that was a little bit of a red flag that made her seem a little suspicious. Also was the fact that Lizzie was very inconsistent with her answers. She was very inconsistent with her timelines and her answers as to her whereabouts during the time of the murders. First, she told him that she was in the barn trying to find some fishing sinkers. Then she said she was out in the yard. Then she said she was out picking pears. Then she said she was out in the barn eating the pears. And even one point, I believe there's an account I read where she said she was in the kitchen just, sifting through a magazine and that she was ironing some handkerchiefs, right? But one piece of evidence that she was inconsistent with that the police were particularly intrigued by was the fact that she said she was just hanging out in the loft in the barn, upstairs in the barn, just eating her pears, chilling out there when she heard her father grunt from the inside, which is when she ran inside and came across his dead body. And the police thought this was weird because they're like, it's over 90 degrees outside. Who just sits there and chills in a stifling hot barn during that time? And they also did not see any footprints either, which made them curious and didn't really show them that she was there if there were no footprints. Also, how the heck did she hear her father's grunt when she was all the way outside in the barn, yet the maid, Bridget, who was sleeping right upstairs in the loft, didn't hear anything at all? A little suspicious, a little sus, if you will. Now, there are also some pretty damning pieces of evidence that the police found. One of those was the possible murder weapon. They actually found a handleless hatchet blade just hanging out in a random toolbox in the attic. Now, when they went to test this blade, unfortunately, there was absolutely no blood found on it. I think they found one piece of hair, which seemed promising, but that hair ended up just being a cow hair. But obviously, it's suspicious, right? First of all, what was it doing in the toolbox in Lizzie's family's attic? And second of all, why was the handle gone? It kind of makes you think that somebody broke off the handle on purpose. Maybe because there was some blood on it. Maybe it was some incriminating evidence. Also, one thing to note is when the police found Lizzie Borden, she had absolutely no blood on her dress. It looked very, very clean. However, she did have a little bit of blood on her undergarments. And she had mentioned that there were some bloody rags hanging out in a bucket downstairs in the basement. Now, when the police asked her about all this, she just kind of shrugged her shoulders and said, "Oh, I had my period, that's why." Now, back then, police didn't really have the technology to be able to test blood and DNA and see who the blood belonged to. So they kind of just believed her and they was like, "Oh, okay. You have your period. I don't want to hear anymore," right? Because that was not a topic that anyone talked about back in the Victorian era. That was a shameful thing to discuss, even though it's a naturally bodily thing that happened to women every month. But nevertheless, the police kind of just minded their own business and didn't ask her anything more about it, which pretty shoddy police work, right? I mean, come on. Also, a doctor came forward and told the police that Lizzie had actually been to him a few weeks prior. I'm not sure if it was a few days prior or a few weeks, but regardless, it was shortly before the murders of Abby and Andrew Borden. And she had asked this doctor for prussic acid. Now, when the doctor asked her why she needed it, she said apparently she needed it to clean, which did not rub the doctor the right way because obviously it could be used for more harmful things such as poison. And he decided, no, I'm not going to give it to you. Well, interestingly enough, the Borden family, Andrew and Abby Borden, and the maid were all very sick just a few days leading up to the murders. They complained of having horrible stomach aches, like the stomach flu, and they were vomiting all the time. Now you would think that Lizzie too would have been sick during this time, because whatever they had ingested, she must have ingested as well. But she actually talked to a neighborhood friend named Alice Russell about this and told Alice that she was sick, but that she heard them vomiting all the time and that she wasn't vomiting. Which you'd think if she was sick like them and ingested the same poison or whatever it was, some people thought that it was just food poisoning because they had the same breakfast soup called mutton 4 days in a row, but still, it's a little odd. Also, Abby Borden was actually very, very scared by this, and she's actually the one who went to their family doctor called Dr. Bowen and complained to him and said, listen, we're all sick. Is it possible that someone could be trying to poison our family? Andrew Borden said to her, no, don't worry about it. It's no big deal. It's probably just food poisoning. You're overreacting. But was she? Was she truly overreacting? Because just a few days later, she ended up dying and getting brutally, brutally murdered. Now, Alice Russell, the person I just mentioned a few minutes ago, the neighborhood friend of Lizzie, she actually came forward to police and told them that just the day before the murders, Lizzie was acting very strange, and that she had confessed to Alice that she was very worried about her family, that she felt perhaps someone was trying to come after her father even, and she was worried that her father was going to get killed, which, I don't know about you, but it seems a little bit like suspicious, kind of coinkydink that, oh, you're just gonna tell your friend that you think your father's gonna die the day before he's murdered. Almost like she's trying to set it up and make her friend believe even more so in the fact that someone could murder her father, and maybe perhaps take the suspicions away from Lizzie. I don't know, that's just my theory, that's just my thoughts on it. But anyway, as you can see, there's a lot of damning evidence that was stacked up against Lizzie. And so the police decided then, several days later after the murders, to charge Lizzie with the murder of Abby and Andrew Borden. And her trial ended up taking place about 10 months later in June of 1893 in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Now this trial was wild. And what I mean by wild is it made all kinds of headlines. All the newspapers were talking about it, and it became the crime and the trial of the century. I mean, think about it. This is the Victorian era. Women weren't seen as being these malicious, violent creatures. They were seen as being these very gentle, docile, nurturing, motherly people. And so the fact that this really small, petite, very devout Christian woman who was involved in her community and charities, the idea that someone like that could perhaps be involved with such a gruesome, violent, horrible scene was just shocking and almost impossible for anyone to wrap their heads around and understand. So at this trial, Lizzie was studied so much by the jurors, by the judges, by the police, by everyone that came to the trial, and they watched her every single move. They watched what she wore, they watched her interactions and everything. Now the prosecution team honestly did not have a very solid case. You think that they would, but all the evidence they had was circumstantial, right? There was no hardcore evidence or proof that linked Lizzie to the murder of Andrew and Abby Borden. Now they did use the inquest testimony where Lizzie was very inconsistent with her answers as her biggest piece of evidence to show guilt. However, it was proven that she was actually prescribed morphine by a doctor shortly before inquest testimony and even the hearing and the trial. And the levels of morphine that she was given were very large doses. Actually, back then, morphine was a very common part of natural medicine, and morphine was given to people in double the doses than perhaps morphine would be given today to someone on their deathbed in hospice, and so she was given a lot of morphine. So the prosecution didn't have much of a case because the defense argued, well, hello, yeah, she was confused then, which means that even though she was inconsistent with her answers, that was most likely just due to the morphine. So that was seen as being inadmissible in court and was no longer seen as being evidence. Now, Alice Russell, though, the same neighborhood friend I had mentioned before, actually came forward and said that she saw Lizzie Borden burning a dress on her stovetop. Now she said when she confronted Lizzie about burning this random dress while this investigation was going on shortly after the deaths of her parents, Lizzie said, "Oh, there's just a major paint stain on my dress, so I'm just trying to get rid of it." Like, hello? I mean, who gets rid of a dress? Think about this is the Victorian era. These dresses were so expensive, especially dresses that were made and tailored to fit someone's particular body and their form. Who would just get rid of a dress like that? Even if it just had a stain, you could wash it out. You could give it to someone else who might want to wear it. You know, and it's just weird. Like, why would you just burn a dress? And of course, though, Emma Borden came to the stand and she defended her sister and said, "Oh no, actually it was my idea to burn the dress. I told her to get rid of that wretched thing. That's just what we did in our family. To get rid of things we didn't want anymore, we would burn them." So, I mean, obviously it's not very believable, but what could the police do at this point? I mean, they didn't know where the dress was. Obviously it had been burned, so they couldn't even, you know, take the dress and use it as evidence. I mean, kind of the explanation made sense, but also kind of not. Obviously, I think it doesn't make sense because I believe that Lizzie most likely was destroying evidence that perhaps there was actually blood on the dress, and perhaps that was a dress she used to kill either Andrew or Abby Borden, and she burned it to get rid of it, and so there was no more evidence. Now, the defense really honed in on the fact that Lizzie was a good Christian woman, and she had this good Christian character. She was involved in her church. She was a Sunday school teacher. She gave to different charities. And also, which was very, very weird, they ended up bringing in the skulls of Andrew and Abby Borden, which would never be done in today's day and age. And apparently, as soon as Lizzie saw these skulls, she passed out immediately. So the defense was able to use that to their advantage and say, look, she couldn't have killed her parents. She passed out when she saw their skulls. Oh, wow, she's so innocent. Okay. So the jury took only about an hour and a half to decide their verdict, and they found Lizzie not guilty for the murder of Andrew and Abby Borden, which meant she was acquitted and she was a free woman. She was ready to walk and live the rest of her life as a free woman. And actually, it said that upon hearing this news, a lot of people were very happy. They were thrilled. They were cheering on as Lizzie left the courtroom. Even judges were crying, and lots of men in the audience were crying, which is pretty pathetic. But it just goes to show just how ignorant all these people were and how they didn't realize that they were letting this woman getting away with a brutal murder, most likely. Now, let's talk about what happened to Lizzie after she was freed. She actually ended up getting a very large house with her sister Emma on the hill, which is what they always wanted. It was their dream house, and they decided to call it Maplecroft. And it said that Lizzie got just very involved with a lot of different famous people, such as a very particularly famous actress in the time. She was always throwing these parties and living this very glam and glitz lifestyle that she never got to live when she was younger. However, though, it was not all rainbows and butterflies, because there were still a lot of people in the town who truly believed that she did it, that she murdered her parents in cold blood, and that she had just gotten away with it. In fact, her own church ended up shunning her, and she wasn't allowed to come back, which was very difficult for her because for the longest time, her church was the biggest, most important part of her life. And so instead of moving away, which you think she would after everything that happened, she decided to stay on the hill and kind of isolate herself and withdraw herself from the rest of society. And it said that she kind of just lived with a bunch of dogs because, again, she loved animals, which I can relate. If it were me in that position, I'd want to live with a bunch of cats. But anyway, it was really just her, and she lived a very kind of lonely, solemn life and solitude, because even her older sister Emma, after a while, had nothing to do with her and left the new home and kind of lived a life on her own. Now, Lizzie ended up dying at the age of 67 from pneumonia. What was actually very interesting is just several days later, her older sister Emma ends up passing away from kidney failure in a different state. Now, it's said that Lizzie's grave is right next to her mother, or her mother and her father's graves. I'm assuming you can go visit it if you want. And actually, the old Borden home, which is where Lizzie lived with Abby and Andrew and Emma, is now a bed and breakfast. So if you ever want to go and stay there, you stop on by Massachusetts, go right ahead. Now let's talk about the theories here, because obviously there's a big theory, which is that Lizzie did it, but there's also other theories that are maybe not so popular. The first theory is that it was an unknown intruder. Now, I forgot to mention earlier that when Lizzie was talking to Alice Russell, her neighborhood friend, she mentioned to her friend that her father had a lot of enemies because he was known to be a shrewd businessman, he was known to be a no-nonsense person, and that because of this, a lot of people were angry with him and the way he dealt with his business. And she also told Alice that she overheard one time her father getting into a pretty verbally aggressive argument with two other men, and that the day of the murders, Lizzie actually told police that she heard an angry man knocking at the door. So there is that theory that perhaps it was somebody who wanted to kind of get rid of Andrew. Maybe they were upset with the way he treated them or dealt with them when it came to business. Maybe they just wanted, I don't know, to punch him out, murder him, slaughter him. You know, they were angry. But obviously this theory doesn't really have much to back it up, and it's pretty much all just hearsay. I mean, it's coming from Lizzie, so I don't know if we should necessarily believe that theory because it's coming from a woman that probably is not the most credible, trustworthy person out there. The other theory is that perhaps Jonathan Morse, the uncle who was visiting at that time, remember, that he was responsible for their murders, because actually him and Andrew Borden were involved in a business venture together, and unfortunately that business venture failed. While Andrew Borden still had a lot of financial security, Jonathan Morse did not. He was actually struggling a lot financially. So people seem to believe that maybe John was pretty upset and jealous over the fact that their business venture failed, but Andrew was still doing great and John was still not. Maybe that's why he killed the Bordens. But again, he had a pretty clear alibi. He wasn't really seen anywhere near the house at the time of the murders. He was either out visiting family members or buying a pair of oxen, whatever it was that he was doing. So that was pretty quickly ruled out. Then there is a theory that Bridget Sullivan, the maid, was an accomplice to Lizzie. There's a theory going around that perhaps they were involved in some kind of romantic relationship, and that Andrew Borden found out, which is why Andrew Borden's eyes were bludgeoned. I mean, his face was bludgeoned, his whole face was disfigured and beyond recognition, but his eyeballs are also taken out, bludgeoned out, which people think that might symbolize perhaps maybe he had seen Lizzie together with Bridget Sullivan, and obviously being gay back then would have been like this horrible thing and everyone would make a big deal out of it and you would be an outcast in society. So that's a very real possibility as well, that maybe Lizzie and Bridget came together and decided to kill Andrew and Abby Borden because maybe they were afraid that their secret would get out. Then obviously the main theory, and the one that most people, including myself, believe, is that Lizzie is completely 100% guilty for the murder of her parents. And I mean, come on, we have all this evidence that stacks up against her. The fact that she burned that dress suspiciously, the fact that a handleless hatchet blade, which is more than likely the murder weapon, was found in her attic in a toolbox, almost like she wanted to throw police off and make them believe that this was just a piece of junk that didn't matter. The fact that she had blood on her undergarments, the fact that she had bloody rags in the basement, the fact that she acted emotionless and suspicious, and just kind of the fact even that she had the most to gain from murdering her parents, right? All this built up resentment and tension in the family dynamic that led up to their brutal murder. Now, to go even a little bit further beyond that, which is something I found very, very fascinating, which I didn't learn about when I first looked into this case. When Andrew Borden's body was found, he was actually laying with his head on top of a wool jacket. Now, this wool jacket was said to be a pretty expensive piece of clothing, and as you guys know, Andrew Borden was a very frugal man. He didn't buy anything that was very necessary. So the few niceties that he did allow himself to own were things that he really cherished and took good care of and took pride in. So people thought it was a little weird, you know, later on, much later after the case, looking back at this case, that he was just laying on top of this very nice, very expensive wool coat when he knew he was going to be sweating from being outside, and he took care of this wool coat. So why would he just lay on it as though it was a pillow? So people think that perhaps Lizzie planted it there, that Lizzie wore the wool coat while she was brutally bludgeoning her father to death, and then just took it off and put it underneath his head, so that way she didn't have any blood on any clothing, and that she quickly washed her body off before she went ahead and called up to Bridget that her father was dead and that they needed a doctor and blah, 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 right? And I guess that makes sense too, because how else would she have had enough time? Think about it. She had blood splatter all over her clothing. How else would she have had time to clean? How would she have had time to clean it up really fast when pretty much really soon after she found her father's dead body, she called up to Bridget and told Bridget to come down and check it out, right? And we know there most likely was a bloody dress that she burned on the stove to get rid of evidence, but perhaps that dress was a dress she wore when she killed Abby. And perhaps she then disposed of that dress after she killed Abby, and then decided to just wear her father's wool coat when she killed her father, placed under his head as though to act that it was always there, and that's the end of it, right? You know, there also was a little bit of speculation that perhaps there was some abuse going on in the Borden household, which I don't really want to get too into because it might not be an appropriate thing to talk about on this channel. Also, it might trigger some people who have gone through something like this. But we do know that Emma said something very odd after the murders. She once told someone, she might have been interviewed, I'm not sure, that there were certain things that happened in her and Lizzie's childhood that she did not want to talk about. So people think it's very possible that perhaps Andrew was abusing the girls, and maybe that was even more of a motivation for Lizzie to murder him. But that's really it. I mean, those are all the theories. I don't know about you guys. I think that it's pretty proven that Lizzie did it and she got away with murder. And this case is so interesting because it kind of teaches you a very valuable lesson, which is that you should never judge a book by its cover. Now, when we learn that lesson as little children, it usually has a positive connotation, right? For example, when we all watched the movie Beauty and the Beast or heard of the fairy tale, right? Where it pretty much teaches us that beauty lies within the inside. It's not on the outside that's what counts. It's on the inside that matters. So never judge a book by its cover. But in this case, I think it's safe to say that it's the other way around too. That sometimes people might seem trustworthy or kind or loving or even beautiful on the outside, but there's a very dark monster that lies within. So let me know what you guys think about this case in the comments down below. Let me know too. Do you think that Lizzie Borden did it, or perhaps do you have some other theories of your own? If you'd like to see more content like this on my channel, please go ahead to feel free and comment down below, like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye!